All right, chapter 23, time to start that one. So chapter 23 is all about the urinary system, so how the kidneys take your blood, filter it, create urine, and how that urine is excreted out of the out as waste. So talking about the urinary system, so here's your kidneys. So you have the renal artery coming in, renal vein going back out, feeding the kidneys so they can filter the blood. Then later we'll talk about how that blood is then processed, or at least the filtrate, then eventually exiting out the kidney through the ureters, sending the waste into the bladder, and then how that exits out of the body. So jobs of the kidneys: filter the blood and excrete toxic metabolic waste, so that's its main job. Helps to regulate blood volume, pressure, and osmolarity through exchanges of water, so that you can maintain blood volume by adding more water or not absorbing more water from the filtrate. Regulate electrolytes and acid-base balance, so through the exchange of different ions in the filtrate. Secrete erythropoietin, which helps to stimulate blood cells production, helps to regulate calcium levels by regulating, participating in calcitriol synthesis, so something you've learned from AP1, kind of near the end. Clears hormones from the blood, so again, as you're filtering it through. Helps to detoxify free radicals, so again, as you're filtering blood through that system. And then lastly, in starvation, to help synthesize glucose from amino acids. But mostly we'll just talk about the urine production for this chapter. So one of the types of waste that is produced by the body are nitrogenous waste. And particularly focusing on the for the endocrine system, you have urea, which is kind of the more known one. So that's the breakdown from proteins, which also involves the liver converting the ammonia to urea, and then that urea is excreted out through the kidneys. Then you also have uric acid, which is from your nucleic acid catabolism, so breakdown of your DNA, RNA, nucleic acids. And then lastly, from the creatine nitrogenous waste made from creatine phosphate catabolism, so still breaking down that molecule. So the urinary system is just one of the systems that helps to carry out excretion or eliminating some kind of waste. So respiratory system, major one is carbon dioxide. Your integumentary system, or skin, so water, salts, lactic acid, and urea, and sweat. Digestive system, so all the waste and byproducts from digestion that gets excreted out as poop. And then your urinary system, in filtering out the blood and helping to detox the body, and then that's released as urine. So major parts of the kidney, and actually I'm going to go to this portion of the kidney. So there's two major zones that make up your kidney, and I'll show you in a picture later. That's kind of a lot prettier. You have the outer renal cortex. So as you're making your urine, this will actually how your urine process starts. So starting from the outer renal cortex, moving into the inner renal medulla, made up of your renal columns and renal pyramids. So I'll show that later. And one lobe of the kidney is the one pyramid and the cortex that's on top of it. So it would be one of the pyramids here, and then the outer renal cortex that overlies it. So during the process of urine, once that filtrate processes through different structures in the cortex and then through your renal pyramid, it gets collected into different vesicles. So that's your minor calyx, and then they join together to form your major calyces. finally emptying into your renal pelvis and down into the ureters, which are the tubes that carry your urine into the bladder. So here's our nice pretty picture. So cortex on the outside, so just like your brain. The medulla more on the inside. So inside your medulla you have your pyramids, which they look more triangular shaped in our kind of nice pretty picture version of them, but in this little cut section not so triangular shaped. In between your pyramids are your renal columns, and then draining away from the pyramids and going towards your bladder you have your minor calyces, then your major calyces, then filtering into the renal pelvis, and then finally out into the ureters. So part of the urine production process is taking in blood and then filtering it to start the process of detoxing whatever in the blood. So the blood vessel that feeds into the kidney, and all of this goes in and out in one part of the kidney. So we have our renal artery feeding into the kidney, going all the way back into your renal cortex, and then that blood goes right away from the renal cortex, and we'll discover this why later, going from the renal cortex and going back out, feeding into the renal vein. So whatever gets filtered and created as urine also goes out the same direction, going through its whole process and eventually being sent out through the ureters. So in your renal cortex, which is this area here in our little picture, that's the outside area of the cortex, and then here's the medulla, more the inside. So there's two major blood vessels that help to circulate blood in these areas. You have your peritubular capillaries, so like here, and they help to supply the kidney tissue near the glomerulus, which is this ball structure here, and the proximal and distal convoluted tube. So convoluted, just a fancy word for saying all folded up and tangled. So here we have our proximal tubes, which are near the glomerulus, and then the filtrate gets sent down the nephron loop, coming back up, and then the distal or further away tubes, again convoluted, so kind of folded up here, going into your collecting vessel here. So the peritubular capillaries supply the tissue in the cortex, and in the medulla you have your vasa recta, which supplies the blood around the nephron loop portion of the nephron. So this whole structure going from the glomerulus, proximal convoluted tubes all folded up, nephron loop, and then your distal convoluted tube is your nephron. So that's what we're going to focus on when we're dealing with the urine production. So on our nephron, so here's a kind of more simplified version. We have our blood vessel feeding into this first portion of our nephron, which is this whole entire structure here. So we have our glomerulus, which is this section, proximal convoluted tube, nephron loop, distal convoluted tube, and then all of that flows into the collecting duct, which will eventually filter into the minor calyx and then major calyx, and then finally into the ureters to be exited out as part of the bladder, exited from the bladder. So that only collects urine once everything has been processed here. So the first part of this nephron is the renal corpsicle, which is here, and it contains the glomerulus as well as the glomerular capsule that encloses the glomerulus, and that's our first stop for making of urine. So in the renal corpsicle, you have your vascular end, so this is where you have your blood vessels. So you have blood flowing into the renal corpsicle, So flowing into the glomerulus where the blood is then filtered, and then your red blood cells, since they're not escaping, they're going to come right back out, as well as some of your other large proteins and larger molecules going right back out the vascular end. The liquid portion that is filtered from the blood gets sent out of the renal corpsicle into the proximal convoluted tube, so the next stop in our nephron, and this makes up your urinary pole. So your renal tubules going away from your renal corpsicle has multiple parts, eventually leading to your collecting duct. So there's 4 regions. Again, your proximal convoluted tube, that's 1. Your 2, which is your Nephron Loop. So each of these is going to have the number when we describe them later. 3, distal convoluted tube. 4 is your collecting duct. So first one's your proximal convoluted tube. It has a lot of microvilli for reabsorption, so it's kind of like cleaning out your refrigerator, where in the renal corpsicle, in the glomerulus, you'll have like you're filtering out the blood. So this is kind of like taking out everything out of the refrigerator except for major stuff that you know you're going to keep, like your milk or something you know that isn't possibly spoiled. Then here in our proximal convoluted tube, this is where you're taking back stuff that you know is still good. So in the case of our body, we're bringing back glucose. We're bringing back things that the body either typically needs or we already know that we need. So some of the ions and whatnot. So we're filtering back. So lots of microvilli for absorption, bringing back stuff we definitely know we need. So next section is the Nephron Loop. So major portion of the Nephron Loop has to deal with the transport of salts as well as some of water transport. So it has 2 different segments. Thick segments, more important for salts, and we'll talk about that a little bit more specific later. Thin segment has cells that are very permeable to water, so they have a lot of aquaporins to allow water to pass. Next step, so we've dipped down, come back up. Distal convoluted tube. So no microvilli here, so we're done with absorbing stuff from our filtrate. It helps with the last kind of final steps for producing your urine before it gets to the convoluted tube and just gets sent out of the kidneys. So the last part of our renal tubules are our collecting ducts. So it receives the fluid from the distal convoluted of multiple nephrons. And then virtually going down to the tip of the medullary pyramid, and then going to those different vessels like the calyxes, and then the renal, I just drew a blank. Oh, there it is, renal pelvis, and then to the ureters, and to the bladder, and then out the body through the urethra. So this little section here actually shows the flow of fluid and the different parts that it goes through. So our blood vessels feed into the glomerular capsule, which then gets sent from there to the proximal convoluted tube, nephron, distal convoluted tube, collecting duct, then a bunch of other ducts that I'm going to not necessarily make you need to know, eventually just sending to the ureter down to your bladder, and then finally out the bladder through the urethra. So here's a simplified version of the nephron. So there's 4 stages that the kidneys use to convert plasma to urine. So again, in our renal corpsicle, where the blood is filtered, making the glomerular filtration, which is the first stage of fluid in a nephron. So it's very similar to your blood plasma, since it's just filtered out from the blood, except for it doesn't have the proteins, since the proteins are too large to pass through. Then the next step is tubular reabsorption. So you're reabsorbing stuff from that blood filtrate, going back into your back into the bloodstream. So If you remember earlier, we talked about the blood supply to our different areas of the nephron. Those blood vessels are going along with the tubules for most of the portion of it, so that you can have this exchange. Okay, so from the proximal convoluted tube to the distal convoluted tube is your tube called your tubular fluid. So this is where you start having the exchange with them, which also includes your tubular secretion. So taking additional items from the blood vessels and taking them into the back into the tubes, not back into, but from the capillaries into the tubes, and that also gets excreted out as part of your waste. So this is kind of like you're cleaning your fridge and you miss some stuff that you should have taken out, but you want to make sure that, okay, I don't know, maybe those olives that you got from that pizza restaurant that's still sitting in that little plastic tub container are still good, or maybe that bottle salad dressing that takes forever to finally expire and you're like, it's okay. And then you realize, oh, I want to take that back too. So this is kind of like a backup for anything that didn't get filtered out here. That waste can get picked up before continuing to circulate through the blood. So the last phase of urine production is water conservation. So this is just removing water from the urine, helps to concentrate it. So once this water is removed, that's the final step, is the fluid, once it enters the collecting duct, is officially called urine. Okay, so you remember all that capillary dynamic stuff and dealing with the pressures moving fluid across the capillaries? Well, it still works in this area, but instead of pushing nutrients to cells and bringing waste from the cells, it has to deal with the filtering of the blood in the renal corpsicle and how the pressures there help to filter the blood. So kind of focusing just like if you think about like the net filtration pressure at the arterial end. So you have your blood hydrostatic pressure, or just your regular blood pressure, which is higher in your glomerular capillaries than in your regular tissue capillaries. You also have the hydrostatic pressure in the capsular space. So this is similar to the hydrostatic pressure of the interstitial fluid, or the fluid that's in the intracellular space. So in here, it's not like a negative number creating that vacuum like you had in your capillary dynamic stuff, but it actually does have a positive pressure. So they're going to work against each other. Next one. You also have your colloid osmotic pressure of the blood. So again, drawing fluid from the tissue space, drawing that water back into the capillaries. And then lastly, colloid osmotic pressure of the tissue space. So in our case, the glomerulus. There's almost no proteins there, so the COP is kind of ignored. So combining all these together, we have our blood pressure here. And then this is countered by the 18 millimeters of mercury pressure from the hydrostatic pressure of the interstitial fluid, or in our case, the glomerular fluid. And then the 32 millimeters of pressure from the colloid osmotic pressure of the blood, pulling fluid into the capillaries. So blood pressure pulling out, hydrostatic pressure of the glomerulus, pushing fluid into the capillaries, colloid osmotic pressure of the blood, pushing fluid into the capillaries. So both of these are going to counter this 60 millimeters of pressure out. So net pressure for filtering blood out, still positive. That allows that fluid to go from the capillaries and into the glomerulus so that your kidneys can then process that, filtrate, and create urine. So here's just a cute picture version of it. Blood pressure pushing out of the capillaries and the other two pressures working against it. So we take the net filtration pressure and we multiply it by how permeable the surface area for the filtration barrier, which again is our capillaries in our case, and that gives us our glomerular filtration rate, so how much filtrate is produced per minute by both of the kidneys combined, which is greater in males than in females. So with the different forces that are involved, for example, particularly blood pressure, can help to adjust this filtration rate. So although we're filtering a lot of fluid through our kidneys, another reason for drinking your water, although we're producing a lot of filtrate, a lot of it's reabsorbed, so that's why we only have about 1 to 2 liters of urine that's excreted per day. So sometimes there can be problems if your filtration rate is either too high or too low. So if your glomerular filtration rate is too high, so let's say you have high blood pressure, then the fluid goes through those the tubules too fast, so they can't reabsorb the water and solutes that the body needs. So for example, the glucose, bringing that back in, bringing in enough water back into the body, so it ends up causing dehydration, as well as electrolyte depletion, so the ions that they would have normally been brought back into the capillaries through reabsorption. So this causes an increase in urine output, and sometimes even possibly things get excreted out that shouldn't be. So when we meet for lab to do the urinalysis lab, we'll look at some abnormal samples, and sometimes you can actually get sugar excreted out or your glucose excreted out as part of the urine, and that actually really technically shouldn't happen. There shouldn't be a big output of glucose because our body's stingy, very needy, and wants to soak up all the sugar that it wants, so it makes sure that, you know, if just so happen a famine starts tomorrow, that you have all the glucose that you could possibly have. Unfortunate, you know, effect of our bodies having to go through the Ice Age and other, you know, times of ancient history where famine was quite common. Okay. On the flip side, if your filtration rate is too low, then the waste are reabsorbed, so the fluid's going through so slowly that the waste are reabsorbed back into those capillaries, and therefore your blood isn't really getting filtered like it should. So there's 3 ways to adjust the GFR to make sure that the filtration rate stays at a stable or homeostatic level. So that's your renal autoregulation, sympathetic, nervous system control, as well as hormonal control. So first, with your renal autoregulation, so this is your kidneys adjusting the own flow of the fluid. So this, even though you can have changes in the blood pressure, which your kidneys can't control, you still have 2 mechanisms in the kidney to adjust the flow of fluid. So that's through your myogenic mechanism and your tubuloglomerular feedback. So I'm just showing you this picture, just showing you the different cells that are involved later that I'll talk about them. So for example, the efferent arteriole, sorry, not the efferent one, afferent arteriole, so going into the glomerulus. So you have these granular cells here that I'll talk about later that help to adjust the flow of blood into the cells, as well as the other parts of the renal corpsicle. Just so efferent, of course, it's your exiting one. We have the sympathetic nerve cell that's signaling these granular cells. You have the macula densa, so these cells here, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So I just want you to have a picture of it and where they are before I start talking about them. Okay, so the myogenic mechanism allows the smooth muscle to contract, so too much pressure that stretches out those muscular cells and causes them to contract. So blood pressure increases, then the afferent arteriole, so the blood vessel going into the glomerulus, will constrict, so that helps to prevent the blood flow. So less blood is going into the renal corpsicle or glomerulus. An opposite effect if the blood pressure falls, so the afferent arteriole relaxes, so it gets smaller because there's less fluid pushing on those on that blood vessel. So in order to increase the pressure so that your GFR doesn't come too low, the afferent arteriole dilates to allow more blood to flow through, and therefore keeps your GFR rate up. The next one for renal autoregulation, so kidneys being able to fix their GFR by itself, so the glomerular filtration rate, has to deal with the downstream tubular fluid, so getting feedback from the tubular fluid that's past the glomerulus. So it helps to adjust the filtration rate so that you can maintain a particular filtrate composition. Helps to stabilize your kidney performance since you're doing a lot of exchanges in those tubes, and you want to make sure that you have the appropriate amount of time to do so. And again, to compensate due to blood pressure, since the kidneys can't control blood pressure. So here's an example of renal autoregulation through the tubuloglomerular feedback. So we have, in this case, we have a high GFR. This leads to increased sodium chloride or salt load in the nephron loop, so that little part that dips into the medulla. So the macula densa, which are the sensory cells in the nephron loop, so those are those ones that were kind of in that open area at the bottom, and they were just kind of right there at the top by the glomerulus. They'll secrete ATP, which nearby mesangial cells will metabolize them to adenosine, so breaking down of the ATP molecule. That adenosine will stimulate the granular cells that are around the arterioles, so the afferent arteriole feeding into the glomerulus. It'll stimulate those to constrict, and therefore causing less blood flow into the glomerulus, and therefore reducing the glomerular filtration rate since you have less fluid going through it. So the main thing, at least to get through this one, to kind of know the steps, are the ones in bold up here at the top. So high GFR rate causes increased sodium chloride load in the nephron loop, and then there's some signaling happening from this feedback that causes the afferent arteriole to constrict, and therefore reducing the glomerular filtration rate. Okay, so other cases. So this one actually is the same one from the slide previous. GFR rises. This is your tubular glomerular feedback, and then the adenosine and how it causes the afferent arteriole to constrict, so it becomes smaller, and therefore reducing flow into the renal corpsicle. If the GFR falls, so low flow of fluid through the glomerulus, then the macula relaxes, and therefore allowing for increased blood flow, and therefore allowing the GFR to rise back up again. So those granule cells, which again are on the afferent arteriole, so going into the kidney, also contains renin, which is secreted in response to a drop in blood pressure. So from first semester, I think, we kind of talked about it a little bit. It helps to participate in the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, which we'll talk about a little later. Helps to control your blood volume and pressure. So it helps to regulate your GFR, but it can't do it consistently. So it's kind of like a cute short-term fix. But it's the outside changing of the blood pressure that helps to keep stuff stable. Okay, so next type of control is from the sympathetic nervous system. So this is the fight or flight part of your autonomic nervous system, so the part of your nervous system that is not consciously controlled by your brain. So your sympathetic nervous system as well as your adrenal glands, which are the little glands that sit on top of your kidneys, will send signals to help the afferent arterioles constrict and therefore reduce blood flow into the kidneys, which therefore is going to reduce your urine output. So when you're in an action type of situation, you don't have to go to the bathroom. When you're trying to run away from a predator, you can focus all your, again, not only your blood to your skeletal muscles so you can keep going, but you're not having this urge to stop and go to the bathroom on your way. So it redirects the blood from the kidneys to your heart, brain, and skeletal muscles so it can be active, and greatly, significantly drops your GFR just during that type of situation. And the last step is hormonal control, so bringing back our renin, angiotensin, aldosterone mechanism that we slightly mentioned earlier. So this set of hormones help control your blood pressure, so this is controlling it from the outside of the kidneys and help to control the GFR by adjusting the blood pressure that's going into the kidneys. So if there's a drop in your blood pressure, your baroreceptors, so in your carotid artery as well as in the aorta, help to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, which triggers the release of renin by those granular cells, the ones that are outside the afferent arterioles, which then gets converted to angiotensin, which then gets converted into angiotensin 1. Steps I don't really need to know. You'll have to know them later, but just part of that whole system. Where are we? There we go. Okay. So down to angiotensin 1, and then eventually that's get converted to angiotensin 2. So they're just showing you all the different little conversions for the renin molecule. So the important one of that whole little pathway is angiotensin 2, which is the actual hormone that increases your blood pressure. So it works as a vasoconstrictor, so reducing the size of your blood vessels and therefore increasing the pressure since you have less volume for the blood to go, and so there's more pressure because it's squeezed on. Helps to constrict your efferent arteriole, which helps to raise your GFR. So even your exiting arteriole, helping to prevent flow from going too fast through the glomerulus. Helps with reabsorption of your sodium chloride and water. Promotes sodium and water reabsorption in the distal convoluted tube as well as the collecting duct, so right before you finish up your urine production, so kind of last